the Viper boss mocked his plus-size maid, until she was the only one who could open his dead wife's vault. The uniform did not fit. Grace Bellamy had known it the moment she pulled it on in the servants' quarters. Too tight across the shoulders, straining at the buttons along her ribs, the hem sitting wrong at her hips because whoever had sewn it had never measured a body like hers. She adjusted the seam at her left side with 3 fingers, a habit from years at a cutting table, and walked into the corridor of the Russo mansion with her chin level and her eyes open. The staff found reasons to look elsewhere as she passed. Enzo Russo came down the hall on her second morning, smiled the way men smile when they want to be seen as charming rather than cruel, and said something about silver trays and accidents. Grace pulled the seam at her hip flat and kept walking. But she had already noticed something. The uniform she was wearing had been altered before. The shoulders had been taken in for someone narrower. The front panel had been let out in a way that did not match the original pattern. The stitching at the waist was a different tension than the rest. Someone had adjusted this garment for a body that did not belong to a maid. Grace filed it and said nothing. That evening, Mrs. Vela, the head housekeeper, a small woman with careful eyes and a mouth that rarely opened past what was necessary, assigned Grace to carry fresh linens to the West Corridor. The West Corridor had been closed since Mara Russo died 3 years ago. Grace carried the linens to the door at the end of the hall. Damien Russo was already standing in it. He was taller than she had expected from the portraits. Colder, too, the kind of cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with a man who had learned to stop expecting things to go right. He looked at Grace. He looked at the linens. He did not smile. "This house breaks delicate things," he said. "Try not to be one of them." Grace met his eyes. "I was not built delicate, sir." Something moved across Damien's face, not quite surprise, not quite displeasure. He looked at her the way people look at a piece of furniture that has been placed slightly wrong in a room they have memorized. He told her to leave the linens and stay out of the West Wing. He told her specifically to stay away from his wife's dressing room. Then he turned and walked back into the corridor, and the door to the West Wing began to close behind him. It did not close all the way. The lock clicked once, and then Grace heard a second sound, lower, mechanical, like a latch releasing from inside. The door drifted open again. She looked down the hall. At the far end, the dressing room door stood open. Grace should have left. She walked toward it instead. The dressing room had been kept exactly as it was the night Mara Russo died. Perfume, white gloves, wedding shoes in their box, a corset hanging behind the curtain rod, and at the center of the room, locked in a glass cabinet, with a bolt that had not been opened since the funeral, the wedding gown. Grace did not look at it as a mourner. She looked at it as a seamstress. Even through the glass, she could see it. The waist seams were asymmetrical, not by accident, not by the settling of old fabric, but deliberately placed at intervals that had no business being in a bridal gown. The pearl clusters along the bodice did not form any standard floral pattern. They were spaced with the precision of notation, not decoration. The folds at the skirt were timed. She was sure of it. 3 inches, then 2, then 4, in a rhythm that repeated, and along the neckline, barely visible between the layers of ivory lace, a line of red thread that did not belong to the original construction. Grace leaned closer to the glass and read it. Only the body remembers the truth. She straightened up. Behind her, Damien Russo said, "That dress is not for your hands." Grace turned slowly. Then whoever left the message should not have written it in thread. He did not believe her. She had not expected him to. Damien told her she was a new maid inventing a mystery, and that ended with a reassignment to the laundry. Before she left the room, Grace saw one more thing. A gold pin pressed into the seam at the left breast of the gown. Not a dressmaker's pin, not a marking pin. The head was too small and the shaft too narrow. It had been placed after the dress was finished. It was a key. She did not take it. Not yet. In a house like this, knowing something too soon was almost as dangerous as not knowing it at all. Breakfast in the Russo dining room the following morning was a performance Grace watched from the side table while she poured. Enzo sat across from Damien, cutting his food with the particular ease of someone who had nothing to prove because he had already won something no one else had noticed. Arturo Bellini sat near the window, the former manager of Russo Atelier No. 7, back in the house after 3 years of unexplained absence, his hands folded too neatly over his coffee. Marco Sable was at the far end, the capo who managed transport between the fashion houses, watching everyone the way men watch rooms when they know where all the exits are. Mrs. Vela moved along the wall without speaking. Enzo said to the table that the new maid seemed sturdy enough to survive the season. Light laughter. Damien did not laugh, but he did not stop it either. Grace poured the coffee. Arturo set down his cup and glanced at Marco. A fraction too long, the look of two men who shared a problem. Arturo had managed the atelier. He had vanished the week Mara died and returned without explanation. Marco controlled every transport route between the fashion houses. If something had been moved that night, his name was on the manifest. Mrs. Vela paused at the door when Enzo spoke, just a half-second, before continuing along the wall. Behind the coffee pot, Grace noticed the cuff of Enzo's shirt. The stitching near the wrist had been repaired in a hurry, mended with a thread slightly too red for the cream fabric, the same shade as the thread on Mara's wedding gown. Any one of them could be the thread she was looking for. She did not allow herself to pull it yet. At the far end of the table, Damien received a message on folded paper from one of the guards. He read it without expression and set it aside. Grace caught 2 words before he turned it face down. Atelier audits. Someone outside the family was looking at the fashion house records. She filed it beside everything else. Later, Damien summoned Grace to tell her not to disturb the mourning his house had organized around Mara's memory. Grace said, "I am not guessing. I am reading." He asked her what she had read. She told him the wedding gown contained 3 categories of alteration marks: a section of seam that had been let out, a waist panel that had been taken in on one side only, and a cuff measurement encoded in the red thread that belonged to a man, not a woman. Those marks could have been made by Arturo. They could have belonged to Marco's transport operation. They could have been placed by anyone who had access to the atelier. Damien said the gown had been touched by dozens of hands before the wedding. Then why, Grace said, do the alterations point to someone who tried to wear it after it was finished? Damien said nothing. He did not send her away. The laundry room was 2 floors below the kitchen, and it smelled of hot water and lye soap and the specific exhaustion of fabric that had been cleaned too many times. Grace found the corset in the 3rd hour of her shift. It was tucked inside a coal cloth bag behind the coppered drying pipes, a place no one reached unless they were looking for something, and the only reason Grace reached it was because she had learned years ago that women who needed to hide things in houses full of men chose rooms men never entered. The corset had belonged to Mara. Grace could tell by the construction. The boning channels were hand-stitched in a style she recognized from high-end commission work, the kind of atelier labor that cost more than most people's monthly wages. The fabric was ivory silk, now yellowed at the edges, but the steel bones inside were wrong. Not broken, not bent from wear, cut. Each bone had been trimmed to a specific length, deliberate sequenced cuts along the left panel, the right, the center front. Numbers. Grace measured each bone with her thumb the way she had measured thousands of others, reading the garment the way other people read text. The sequence resolved into coordinates. The mirror room, under the east staircase. Mrs. Vela appeared in the doorway. She did not pretend to be checking on linens. She stood for a moment, looking at the corset spread on the table. Lady Mara once told me the safest place to hide a knife was in a room full of men discussing guns. Grace looked up. You hid this for her. Mrs. Vela did not confirm it with words. She confirmed it by not leaving. The lock code, Grace said. Do you know what she used? She told me only that the right person would understand it without being told. Grace looked at the corset bones. She was right, she said. She went to the mirror room at midnight. Damien was already there. He had been watching her since the laundry room. She understood that now, had understood it since the corridor outside the dressing room, when his anger had been a little too precise for a man who had not already been following her movements. He stood with his back to the mirrored wall, arms crossed, the particular stillness of a man who has learned patience the hard way. You are either working for someone who wants what Mara left behind, he said, or you believe what you are doing. I am not certain which is more dangerous. Grace laid the corset on the table between them. Look at it as a husband, not as a boss. He did not take it, but he did not look away. Mara did not use her own measurements, Grace said. Anyone with her atelier records could have guessed those. She used the deviations, the changes someone else made when they tried the garment on after she finished it. Damien said nothing. She used the alterations, Grace said, not her own measurements. The difference is how much someone else changed the garment when they tried it on after it was finished. Let out the chest, took in the left waist, stretched the right hip. Each deviation is a number. The deviations are the code. Damien's voice was very quiet. You expect me to believe my dead wife hid a murder accusation in underwear? No, Grace said. I expect you to believe your dead wife knew men would never look there. The mirror room had a seam in the back wall that most people would have taken for a join in the paneling. Grace found it with her fingertips in under a minute. Behind the mirror was a vault set into the stone, small, no larger than a document box, with 3 rotating dials labeled in the same small font Russo Atelier used on its custom order forms. Bust, waist, hip. Damien tried the obvious codes first. Mara's measurements, the household emergency number, the wedding date. Nothing. On the 5th attempt, a warning light appeared behind the dials. One more wrong attempt, Grace said, and the mechanism burns. Damien stepped back. Grace entered the three differences. Chest let out. Left waist taken in, right hip stretched. The deviations left by whoever had tried the gown on after it was finished. The vault opened. There was no money inside. Inside, transport invoices for corset frames, a handwritten list of fashion houses with shipment weights that matched no garment she had ever seen ordered, and on the last page, a line of approval. Enzo Russo. Grace set the page down. Damien had not moved. "The first vault does not accuse him of murder," she said. "It proves he had something worth killing for." Damien did not say Enzo's name for a long time. When he spoke, he said Arturo. Arturo had managed the atelier. Arturo had access. Arturo had disappeared after Mara's death and reappeared now without explanation. And Marco? Marco controlled every vehicle, every shipment, every manifest. Marco could have moved anything. Grace did not argue. "Then check all of them," she said, "but do not stop at the men your grief already wants to punish." Damien's jaw tightened. "You have been in my house for 3 days, and your brother has had 3 years to clean it." The silence that followed was a different quality than the silences before it. He ordered her held in the servants' quarters while he verified the vault contents. That night, Mrs. Vela came to Grace's room without knocking, sat in the chair by the window, and spoke in the voice of someone who had been waiting a long time. She told Grace she had helped Mara hide the corset herself. That 2 maids who had helped carry documents from the atelier had disappeared within a month of the death. That she had never been able to open the vault herself. She had chosen Grace because of 2 things: the blind stitch she had used rehemming a curtain in the East Hall, a technique from high-end commission work, not standard domestic service, and the way she had read the uniform on her first day without being told to look. She placed a small black tin on the bed between them. Inside was a scrap of fabric, dark, raw-edged, cut from a larger garment in a hurry. It smelled of machine oil and something underneath the oil, a faint chemical note that Grace recognized after a moment as heat press residue. The kind left by industrial corset frame machinery. There was a burned edge along one side, a fragment of red thread, broken. This was cut from the dress Mara was wearing the night she died, Mrs. Vela said. Grace held it under the lamp. The burn mark was not from fire. It was from a heat press plate, the kind used in industrial atelier work. Mara had not been killed in a street ambush. She had been killed somewhere with machinery. The workroom was at the back of the West Wing, behind a door that had been locked since the renovation 3 years ago and painted over once since then, so that the seam between door and frame was barely visible to anyone who had not spent a decade looking at construction lines. Grace found the door by its paint seam. Inside was a sewing room, not the elegant fitting room of the main dressing suite, but a working space, a cutting table, a dress form, a wall of thread organized by color and weight, the kind of organization that came from a person who thought in fabric, and on the dress form, an unfinished gown. Grace stood in front of it for a long moment. The gown had not been built for the Russo house style. The shoulder softer, the bodice requiring reinforcement a standard mannequin could not replicate, the hip adjusted for a body the house patterns had never accommodated. Grace knew exactly what kind of body that was. She had spent years making the same compensations. Mara had not known Grace, but she had known the right woman would understand it without being told. Grace found the recording in the hem. A small button covered in the same ivory fabric as the gown's lining, sewn into the left hem with a loose stitch that was meant to be found and opened. Inside the button was a device no larger than her thumbnail. She pressed the single contact point. Mara Russo's voice came out of it, low and clear, with the particular composure of someone who had accepted that they might not survive to speak in person. If Damien hears this, then Enzo has already made him believe I died outside the house. A pause. I found the shipment records in September. Enzo had been using the fashion houses for 3 years, the corset frames to move components, the fabric shipments to carry documentation, the transport manifests to clean the money. Arturo managed the physical operation. Marco ran the routes. But Enzo built it. Enzo owns it. Another pause, shorter. He is not afraid of losing the money. He is afraid of Damien learning that he built something Damien did not give him, that he has power Damien does not control. Losing the network means losing the only thing that has ever been entirely his. The voice did not waver. The vault will not open for the man I loved. It will open for the woman he would underestimate. One final line. Do not let him turn my death into another weapon. The recording ended. Grace stood in the workroom for a moment in the silence after it. Then she folded the recording back into its button and walked to find Damien. She found him in the library, standing at the window. Before she crossed the room, she stopped. The scorched edge of the fabric scrap had left a faint burn across 2 fingers. She had not noticed it until the light caught it now. Damien turned before she spoke. He looked at her hand. He said nothing for a moment. Then, sit down. I am fine. I did not ask whether you were fine. He crossed to the cabinet on the far wall and returned with burn salve. Grace sat without being asked twice. He applied it without speaking. In this house, he said quietly, people save the document before the person holding it. Grace met his eyes. Then change the house. He did not respond. But he did not move away either. She set the recording device on the desk. She did not turn it on for him. She waited until he picked it up himself. He listened with his back to her. When it ended, he did not move for a long time. Grace set the red thread spool on the desk beside him. She did not leave this because she stopped loving you, she said. She left it because she knew love would make you blind. Damien's hand closed around the spool. He did not speak. He did not need to. And for the first time since she had walked into the Russo mansion with a uniform that didn't fit, and a house full of people who thought they already knew what she was worth, Grace did not feel like she was arguing to be heard. She felt like she was standing in a room where someone had finally stopped talking long enough to listen. Marco had not appeared at breakfast. He was stopped at the north gate before dawn with a satchel of delivery logs and a promissory letter from Enzo. The one who controlled transport always knew which ledger to take when the walls started closing. Enzo knew the vault had been opened by morning. Grace did not know how. Whether a guard had talked, whether Enzo had his own access to the security system, whether he had simply read Damien's face at breakfast and understood what it meant. But by the time the sun had cleared the east wing, Enzo had stopped pretending. He gave the order to lock the east corridor. He gave a second order that sent 3 men toward the west wing with accelerant. The target was the dressing room, the wedding gown, the corset, the spool of red thread. Everything that had been left to be found. The target was also Mrs. Vela. Grace heard the boots in the corridor and understood what they meant before anyone explained it. She had used dressmaker's pins to block the workroom door lock the night before. A modification too small for any security sweep to catch, and exactly the kind of thing a woman who had spent her life in workrooms knew to do. She moved Mrs. Vela out through the fabric delivery corridor before Enzo's men reached the west wing. The fire caught in the dressing room. Damien saw the smoke from the east terrace. He had not finished verifying the vault contents. He had not completed the accounting of every name on Mara's list. He gave the order anyway. Do not save the vault first. Save the people. It was the first order he had given in 3 years that was not about the dead. The fire took the curtains and the carpet and the lower shelves of the dressing room before it was controlled. The wedding gown survived inside the glass cabinet. Grace carried the unfinished dress from the workroom herself, folded across her arms like an accusation, and walked into the main hall. Enzo was already there. He was calm in the way men are calm when they have decided that calmness is its own kind of threat. He stood in the center of the hall with 2 of his men at his shoulders, and when Grace walked in with the dress, he looked at her with the expression of someone watching something that will not matter in an hour. He told the household Grace had set the fire, that she had fabricated a recording, exploited Damien's grief, stolen from the vault, that she was a planted agent, and that the Russo house did not have conversations about planted agents. Damien said, "Prove it." He was looking at Grace when he said it. She set the unfinished dress on the long table at the center of the hall. She did not have a weapon. She had a dress, a piece of scorched fabric, a spool of red thread, and 22 years of understanding how garments told the truth when people would not. Mara was not killed on the road, Grace said. She laid the scorched fabric scrap on the table. This is heat press residue from the machines used at Russo Atelier No. 7, the only place in the Russo operation that uses this compound. She was killed near that machinery, not in a street ambush. Enzo's expression did not change. She set the thread spool beside the scrap. This thread matches the repair on the cuff of the jacket Enzo wore to Mara's funeral. The repair was done in a hurry, after a tear at the right wrist, consistent with machinery contact. Enzo said, "House managers have sign-off during mourning periods. That is standard. The repair places you at the atelier," Grace said. "The sign-off places you in the records." And this, she lifted the hem of the unfinished dress and turned it toward the hall windows, is a floor plan sewn into the lining. Atelier No. 7's sublevel, where the documentation is stored, where the weapons buyer list is stored, where Mara's last letter to her husband has been sitting for 3 years. She set the dress down, 3 proofs, 1 address, and a recording you have already heard. The hall was quiet. Enzo moved first. His hand went to his jacket. It did not reach what was inside, because the capos, the men who had stood behind Enzo for 3 years, who had followed his orders and accepted his explanations, had heard everything. One of them shifted his weight toward Enzo, then stopped. Enzo looked at him. 3 years, Enzo said quietly. "You know what I have done for this family." The capo looked at the unfinished dress on the table. He looked at Grace. He stepped back. None of them moved to help Enzo. "You chose a maid," Enzo said. He was looking at Damien, not Grace. His voice had lost its steadiness for the first time. "You chose a maid over your own blood." Damien looked at his brother for a long moment. "No," he said, "I chose the woman who told the truth over the man who tailored a lie." He told Enzo to sign the order releasing the full transport records of every fashion house in the Russo operation. Enzo signed. He did not do it quietly. He said that Mara had been foolish too, that she had trusted a few pieces of cloth to do what a gun could not. "No," Grace said. "She knew men like you would never check the seams." He said things after that which Grace let pass through her without holding them, the way you let a hem run through your fingers without catching the thread. The documentation was recovered from Atelier number 7 that afternoon. Arturo and Marco were taken separately. The capos who had received payments from Enzo's operation were identified before nightfall. It was not clean. These things never were. Damien had made the decision knowing what it would cost. Publishing the full records would weaken the Russo family in the short term. The alliances Enzo had built were real, even if the methods were not. Other families would move into the gaps. He had done it anyway. Grace could tell by the way he stood after Enzo was taken out, not triumphant. Just very still, like a man who had chosen the truth at the exact moment it was most expensive. Grace packed her bag that evening. She did not make an announcement about it. She simply began the process of leaving the way she had arrived, quietly, in a uniform that did not fit her, with no particular ceremony. Damien found her in the servants' corridor. He held out a small box. Inside, on a folded square of the same ivory silk as Mara's corset, was a spool of red thread and a key. Not the gold pin from the gown, a different key. Brass, with the Russo family mark on the grip and a single additional mark she did not immediately recognize, the archive symbol, used on document rooms and record vaults. "I need someone who knows where men hide lies when they think women are only decorating the room," Damien said. Grace looked at the key. "You are asking me to be a more senior maid. I am asking you to become the keeper of every secret this house thought it had buried." She looked up at him. "If I stay," she said, "no one in this house makes another remark about my body or what it is suited for. Not as a joke, not as a compliment, not in a corridor where they think I cannot hear." "Agreed." "You agree publicly, in front of the staff." "Yes, and I report to you directly, not to a housekeeper, not through a chain that someone else can edit." "Yes." Grace looked at the key again. She picked it up. Damien moved to leave. He stopped and stooped, very slightly, to pick something up from the floor beside the dress form that stood near the corridor wall. The gold pin from Mara's gown. It had fallen from the evidence box. He held it out. Grace reached for it. Their hands met around the gold pin. Neither of them moved away first. 3 weeks later, the west wing was open again. The cabinet with the wedding gown stood unlocked, the bolt removed, the glass unlatched. Mara's things were still there. Damien had stopped treating them like a shrine and started treating them like a record. One morning, he appeared in the doorway of the dressing room. "What did the house miss?" he asked. Grace was watching a capo pass in the corridor, the seam at his left shoulder slightly uneven, a repair made in a hurry by someone who did not know what they were doing. "Everything important," she said. The Viper boss had spent 3 years trying to force open his dead wife's vault. He had tried codes and keys and ultimatums and violence, and none of it had worked. because the vault had not been built for power. It had been built for perception. The truth had never been locked away from power. It had been sewn where power never bothered to look.